God is good. So here we are. Hebrews 7.
That's why I don't do the bunny ears behind you, because I know.
Right. So we're in Hebrews 7. We're going to do the first 10 verses today. Shane, would you read those first 10 verses for us?
Hey, you want to pray?
Yeah, that'd be good. This King Melchizedek of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham as he was returning from defeating the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned 1/10 of everything. His name in the first place means King of Righteousness. Next he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. See how great he is. Even Abraham, the patriarch, gave him 1/10 of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to collect tithes from the people, that is, from their kindred, though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not belong to their ancestry, collected tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had received the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by those who are mortal. In the other, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who received tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him.
All right. So we are getting back to the main thrust of the argument. He had said in chapter 5 that he was going to get into this discussion of Melchizedek, and then he took a side road and said, never mind, you're lazy listeners, I need to deal with this first. And then he comes back to it and continues where he intended to go all along. The character of Melchizedek is mystery. He's one of those characters that he just comes in the scene for a grand total of 4 verses in the Old Testament. And yet he makes quite a splash in his little 4 verses of story. And so before we get into what the preacher of Hebrews says about him, I want to go back and learn what we can from what the Old Testament says about him. So let's go to Genesis chapter 14. And it's a very bad reference, but it's coming to my mind while I'm turning the pages. If you guys ever watched the, like old Cloak and Dagger sort of TV shows, X-Files is coming to my mind right now. There's always those characters that are only in like 30 seconds of the show, and the whole show was about hoping to see that little character, like it was the smoking man in X-Files, right? Who always turned the plots for the flash that he was on the screen, and Melchizedek is kind of that guy. So Genesis chapter 14, just to give you the context, there's Abraham and Lot accompanies him, and they come into the land of promise. And they've got too many people between them, and we don't know how many people they are, really, but they've got a lot of people with them, and their servants, and their flocks, and their herds, and they can't coexist in the same pasture land. So Lot goes down to the bottom of the valley of the Dead Sea, where water is coming to the Dead Sea from the south, a well-watered plain, and even today, if you look at aerial shots of that area, it's farmland. And he sets up there, and that's where Sodom and Gomorrah were. And Abraham stays up on the highland, in the mountainous region. He lands in Mamre, and that's about 12 or so miles south of Jerusalem. So from where Abraham is, it's possible to imagine him looking down the mountain into the valley and seeing the cities of the plain and where Lot was. And then there's a war, and kings from the north, and what is today's Syria, make a raiding party. And when I first read this, I didn't catch how far away these things are. Like, I was thinking that this was city-state against neighboring city-state, but it's a couple hundred miles. It's like 300 miles that they marched to raid. And they take a bunch of people captive, and among which is Lot, and they go back up into modern-day Syria. And then Abraham goes to rescue his nephew and his nephew's family. And so these people who came and raided defeated 4 city-states armies. And I don't know how many people that is, but 4 little nations' armies were defeated and taken captive. And Abraham arms 318 of his servants. So I didn't also realize how many servants Abraham had. He had 318 men of fighting age in his servants. And he arms them. And he goes and does what 4 city-states couldn't do. And obviously the Lord is with him. And he regains all of the loot and the captives and rescues them and brings them back down to the south. And then he encounters this character for just a couple of verses. So we're going to start reading in verse 17 of Genesis 14. After his return from the defeat of, that name, Kedorlaomer, there you go, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shiva, that is the king's valley, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say that I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. And then he calls out some men who went with him, and he says, let these guys take their share of the spoils. So that's it as far as the historicity of Melchizedek. He shows up, he blesses Abram, he brings bread and wine, Abram tithes to him, and the story moves on. So let's glean everything we can from this to then take with us back to Hebrews. So interesting, Melchizedek calls God by a new name. Up until this point, we have not yet had God called God Most High, and the Hebrew behind that is El Elyon. His covenant name, Yahweh, or if you read the Latin Jehovah, is the name that he gives to Moses, and Moses uses it all throughout the story. Even in the story before that name is given to Moses, Moses uses that name for him. And that is God's personal name, but it's, in a sense, his name to the Jews. It's the covenant Mosaic name of the law that he's called by the Jews. And it's fitting that Melchizedek, who is not a Jew, matter of fact, at this time there's only one Jew, right? It's Abraham. But it's fitting that Melchizedek does not refer to him by that title. Melchizedek calls him God Most High, El Elyon, possessor of heaven and earth. And so this is a universal name for God. This is God, the God of everything, not just the God of the covenant with the Jews. This is the God that's over the Gentiles too. And so this is a universal relationship to God. Melchizedek is a Gentile. And Melchizedek calls him God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And it's interesting, Abraham picks that up immediately. Abraham doesn't argue with him and say, oh, which God is that? Right? It's interesting that the Spirit of God resident in Abraham, or upon Abraham, because he's Old Testament, right, testifies to his heart, to his spirit, that this is a priest of me. And the title that Abraham has never heard, or Abram has never heard before, for this God that he's worshiping, he uses just a few verses later. Look in verse 22. Abram says to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand, I've sworn, to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. The title that Melchizedek just gave. So Abraham adopts it immediately and acknowledges, ratifies, yes, this is my God too. You and I worship the same God. So I think that's cool. It's the first time it's used in the Bible, and it's used then from this point many times. El Elyon is used from this point forward another 20 or so times in the Old Testament. But the title is first given to us by this character Melchizedek. It's interesting to say that he's a priest of God Most High. If you set him aside because he's different, who are priests in the Old Testament?
The Levites?
They're the Levites, descendants of Levi. There's no Levi yet.
Right.
This is Levi's great-grandfather that we're telling the story about. There are no priests. And so for Melchizedek to have the title priest of God Most High, he's the only, and he's the first. So when this title is later applied to Jesus, the Jews might say, oh, well, what is this new priesthood of Melchizedek? But in fact, it antedates the Levitical priesthood by a good long time. And as a matter of fact, the Levites don't just start with Levi. The Levites are consecrated to the priesthood in Exodus 32, about 500 years from the story we're telling now. And so Melchizedek is the original priest 1.0. And the Levitical priest is a second version of a priest. And Melchizedek, we'll get to this later, but his priesthood is eternal. And the Levitical priesthood is bounded in time. It starts in Exodus 32, and it ends in AD 70. And so there is a boundary to the temporal nature of the Levitical priesthood. There is not to Melchizedek. So it's interesting to hear him 500 years before any other priest. And for all we know, the only priest for 500 years. I don't know, we don't have anybody else in the story of Abraham, his children, the slavery in Egypt, the Exodus. We don't have anybody claiming to be a priest of God during that time. So it's an artifact of history that is curious. And it's interesting as well that Abram, obviously Sarah is on board with Abram. Lot, to some degree, is on board with Abram. So his family is there. We assume that his servants are at least, they honor their master and their master's God. I don't know if they would consider themselves followers of Yahweh. But we have like the original follower of Yahweh and the original priest coming together in this scene. And so it's only a couple verses long, but it's foundational for so much of what we understand in the Bible. Then he's called the King of Salem, and that's weird. It's weird. Salem is only used 2 places in the Bible, that word, as a place name. It's the same name as Shalom, which is how Jews greet each other, right? It means peace. But it's only used as a place name twice in the Bible. Once is here, and once is in Psalm 76. If you want to put a finger there, or we can just read it real quick. Psalm 76:2. When someone who isn't my voice gets to Psalm 76, just read the first 2 verses.
1 and 2.
1 and 2.
In Judah, God is known. His name is great in Israel. His abode has been established in Salem. His dwelling place in Zion.
Okay, so now you have read every time the word Salem shows up as a place name in the Bible. And the clues from Psalm 76:2 would make us think that this is Jerusalem. That it's like shortened, the Jeru fell off for some reason. And this is like a nickname. Okay? Because the context of 76:2 says his abode has been established there. So this has led several Bible commentators, many of which I totally respect, even though I'm going to disagree with them now, to say that Melchizedek was, in fact, the king of Jerusalem at the time. And God loves Jerusalem, and God has set his name in Jerusalem, and God always knew he would set his name in Jerusalem. So it can make sense. You can see where they go from here, right? that Melchizedek, the first priest, is priest-king over the city that God will one day set his name in. Makes sense. Except that Jerusalem was not called Jerusalem at the time that this story takes place. Jerusalem came to be called Jerusalem after David conquered it. It was not called Jerusalem then. So the psalmist in 76:2, writing after David, very well could mean Jerusalem, and could be shortening the name of Jerusalem for some poetic meter sense for his psalm. But I think, and a couple of other people that I read, who I also respect, the problem is I like everybody and they don't agree. I'm going to say that this isn't Jerusalem, because that's not called this yet. At the time that this story is written, Jerusalem was called Jebus. And you'll see Jebus, Jebus, referenced several times in Genesis and Exodus. And that's the city that will become Jerusalem after David conquers it. So I don't think he's the physical king of Jerusalem. So then if that's the answer, then the question is, where is Salem? And we don't know. There's a possibility, there's a city that is spelled almost like it, S-H-E-L-I-M, so you'd have to switch the vowel and soften the S, make it a sh instead of a s. So Shalem is a city, and that's in the northern part of this area, almost up to Syria. So it would make sense, if that's it, that Abraham would run into him on his way back from conquering the kings that were up in that area. That could be it. Except that area has been completely archaeologically studied. It's one of the sites that have been gone through a lot, and we know every name of every king of that city, and there's no Melchizedek. So you kind of scratch your head and you're like, okay, well, where was his kingdom? And we know very little bit about this guy, 3 verses. And I'm going to build a case for the fact that this was, in fact, a Christophany. That this was a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus. In which case, his kingdom is not a temporal one at this point. And the fact that, hey, how you doing? Thank you for coming. And the fact that the name King of Salem translates to King of Peace works if it's Jesus. And if it's not trying to be a city-state, it's just, he's the King of Peace. And it would also work if that is supposed to be the Salem of Psalm 76:2, because Jesus will, in the future, rule and reign from Jerusalem, right? So it would totally make sense that Melchizedek shows up and he says, I'm the King of Salem. And you don't call any place that right now. But we will. And I'm the king there. I think that's the best answer to where this guy's kingdom is. I think he was not a king of any city-state at that particular moment. I'm going to build a case that this is Jesus. And that he's announcing his future messianic kingdom from Jerusalem. That'll explain a lot of weird things as we go. Yeah.
Jason, can I read something?
Please do.
This is from...
I'll acknowledge that that's kind of the 2 things that I struggled with this week getting ready, because I love James MacDonald, and I love John MacArthur, and I love J. Vernon McGee. These are some folks that I read like almost every time I get ready. Those 3 guys all say the opinion number 3 that you read. This is just a Canaanite king who is a type of Christ. And the fact that we don't know much about him is fine and is on purpose, and don't stress about it. But then our pastor, Pastor Bill, and Chuck Smith, and Greg Laurie, and David Jeremiah all think that this is Jesus. And I love all those guys too. So I read a bunch of things, and I heard a bunch of sermons, and because I can't just vote for one of those camps ad hominem, after looking at it, I think I'm landing more that this is, in fact...
It would seem to contradict, not contradict, but it would seem to defy the glorious and awesomeness
in his incarnation as the Messiah, because it seems like the context of the New Testament is that is his only incarnation when he comes as the Son of God, the Messiah. There are Christophanies in the Old Testament where he comes. I don't know. It's kind of odd because obviously there are theophanies which are Christophanies at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when he comes as three to Abraham.
Right, and Abraham sees him, yeah.
And do they have literal flesh then?
Yeah.
You know, so it's
and
it's a different kind of incarnation, I guess.
Right.
It's
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and obviously I'm not going to tell you that he lived an entire life as this character named Melchizedek. I'm going to tell you that he appeared to deliver a message and bless Abraham and receive a tithe and set up this picture. And then went away, which is consistent with other Christophanies as he appears as the angel of the Lord and as he appears as you know, the men that...
Appears as a messenger.
Right.
Actually, the angel of the Lord translated means royal messenger.
Yeah. So I'm going to... We'll acknowledge the difficulties as we go, but I'm going to teach from that perspective and just acknowledging good people disagree with me. But our pastor does not, so I think I'm safe.
Why do you call me good?
Right. Okay, there you go. So, King of Salem, there's two ways of seeing it. I think it's most consistent for everything that we're going to see in a little bit, that this is actually a Christophany, okay? His name, this is the only time, if this is a Christophany, this is the only time where he gives himself a name. But it is a title that he will claim elsewhere throughout Scripture. King of Righteousness. Melech just is the Hebrew word for king, and Tzidkenu is righteousness. So a contraction of those. King of Righteousness. He gives himself one of his titles as a name. And then he declares himself as the King of Jerusalem to come, is my understanding of that. So that's where we're going to go on the whole King of Salem thing. The one other thing that supports this, and in what Jesse read already talked about it, but in John 8:54, Jesus says, "Abraham saw my day and was glad and rejoiced." And you would ask the question, where did Abraham see you? Well, he encountered the angel of the Lord a couple of times. And he encountered a theophany where, again, he comes, like Jesse said, he came as three people just before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But there wasn't joy at that encounter. There was bartering, and there was negotiation, and there was, do you really have to do this? And it wasn't necessarily a joyous encounter. But this encounter, where he is blessed and he blesses and he receives gifts and he gives tithes, this is a joyous encounter. So I think that this encounter would more make sense as the antecedent to what Jesus is referencing in John 8 than any other encounter where we would say God is showing up in some physical form and interacting with Abraham. The combination of priest and king is unprecedented in the Bible with everybody except Jesus. If you look at any other king, they are not priests. And if you look at any other priest, they are not kings. And the couple of times that one camp tries to take over the other, things go bad. And we've already kind of rehearsed this a couple weeks ago. When Saul, who was a king, tried to play priest, he had the kingdom taken from him. When Uriah, who was a king, and a good king, tried to play priest, he was a leper for the rest of his life. There's one other time when it might have happened. Samuel was a prophet and a priest. Okay, go potty. Mom will take you. Samuel was a prophet and a priest, and he was offered the kingship. People came to him and said, will you do this for us? And he said no, and they said, well, your sons are losers, and you're old anyway. And that's where Saul comes from. And Samuel knew better than to take up a mantle of political leadership. So priest and king don't occur. Priests are never to wear a crown of political power. Priests are never to sit on a throne. But if you look in Zechariah chapter 6, it's interesting that this is exactly what's supposed to happen with Messiah. So go there. And I always have a hard time finding the minor prophets. So Zechariah is after Haggai. He's near the end of the minor prophets. Zechariah chapter 6, after a whole bunch of examples of why priests and kings should not be the same person, we have Zechariah 6:13 talking of Messiah. It says, "It is he, Messiah, who shall build the temple of the Lord, and shall bear royal honor, and shall sit and rule on his throne." So he's a king. "And there shall be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace shall be between them both, and the crown shall be the temple of the Lord," a reminder to, and all these things. So he shall be a priest on his throne. So Messiah is both a priest and a king, and he's the only one that is supposed to try to pull off both offices at the same time. So for Melchizedek to be a priest and a king, if he isn't a Christophany, then he's the only one besides Jesus who got allowed to operate in both offices simultaneously. And if there were such an amazing person who was not Jesus and was the political leader of a Canaanite city and was also a priest of the Most High God, you would expect that there would be other encounters between his people, his city, and the followers of God in Abraham's tribe, Abraham's followers of people. You'd think that they would be like, "Oh, you're us, you're our people. Hey, let's have a potluck," you know? But there is no such interaction. So, yeah, I've already said I lean towards this being a Christophany. So, let's go to the one other place. Oh no, just kidding. We're still in Genesis. Melchizedek blesses Abraham in the name of God and brings something. What does he bring? What's his gift to Abraham?
Wine and bread.
Bread and wine. What's the significance of that? Those are Jesus' symbols, right? That's the Last Supper. So Melchizedek brings a sign of the universal nature of God's salvation for man to Abraham. I think this is really cool. Those symbols will be restored in their simple form by Jesus again for the Last Supper. Those symbols are a part of Passover, which is for the Jew. And just like Melchizedek is a picture of a priest for all people, for Gentiles, he's a priest of God for the nations. And then there is the subset of priests for Jews, which are the Levites. This symbol of bread and wine is part of the universal salvation of mankind under Melchizedek, and Jesus restores it to that nature under his reign. And the subset of the Jewish nation has Passover as kind of a more Jewish sort of complicated picture. And I think it's cool that it starts simple and it ends simple. Just like the priesthood starts simple with Melchizedek, it ends simple, it's just Jesus. And then the Jewish working of God is kind of in the middle. I think it's also really cool that this may seed the functioning of Passover. And here, this is speculation. So there was an archaeologist with the last name of Kitchens. I don't know what his first name was. Mr. Kitchens. And in the 1920s, he did a lot of work trying to find out who Melchizedek was. And he's the one that did the excavation of this Shelem that might have been Salem. And he did the excavation to document and prove Melchizedek's historicity. And at the end of it, he said, "I can't find any history of Melchizedek here." But he discovered all kinds of other things about this town. And when he did it, he discovered that there was this war of the kings of the plain against the people of the north. He was able to find in the records of this town the stories of the raiding party going down and of Abraham's people coming up. And the names of the kings in the records are different in some spelling and pronunciation than the names of the kings as given in Genesis 14. but a lot of that could be the language difference, but the plot line is the same, right? And he was able to date this to the spring of 1802 BC. We don't know what day, but we know it was in the spring of 1802 BC, according to Kitchen's work, right? Wouldn't it be cool? Passover's in the spring. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be cool? And I don't know if it is, but wouldn't it be cool if this exchange happened on the day that would later become Passover, and that it started simple with a communion between followers of God, and then it became the thing that Passover is, this beautiful symbol, complicated, deep, meaningful, and then it wound up really simple again. I think it would just be neat if that story arc were that. I don't know if it is, but it happened sometime in the spring of 1802 BC. So that's neat. And then Abraham tithes to him, and this is another one of those, start simple, gets big and complex, and then ends simple. Abraham tithes to Melchizedek. Where are we told to tithe? Where does the instruction to tithe come from? As far as, if you go in your Bible and you're like, okay, the Bible says to tithe, where are you going to turn to? Leviticus, right? 500 years later than this story. So the principle of a tithe is part of what the followers of God do. And they did it here 500 years before there was a law. Similar to the Jewish people are told to pick up manna and get twice as much on Friday so they don't have to work on Saturday and they can keep the Sabbath. And that happens, now it's only a couple of months before the law, but still before the law, where the whole do not, honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Right. So that wasn't part of the law either. It's part of what God expected before the law. So there is a sense in which Sabbath, and not all the municipal codes associated with it, but the concept of a rest that's honorable to the Lord, is part of what the people of God just do. Just like a tithe is something that the people of God just do. Abraham does it, and Melchizedek doesn't have to give him revelation and say, God says, give me a tenth of everything you just collected. Mm-hmm. Nope. Abraham recognizes him as a follower of God Most High and as a priest of God Most High, and his immediate response is, here's the best tenth of everything I just got. Give it to you. I think that's really cool. So when Christians pound the we're not under the law, we're not under the law, we're not under the law, I don't have to give 10% to the church. I'm not under the law. I just realized that you can take somebody to Genesis 14 and say, yep, 500 years before the law, you still need to give 10% of your income to the work of the Lord. So the law, yes, we're not under the law, and neither was Melchizedek, neither was Abraham. There is a sense where that's just something we should do. We should be honoring the Lord with our resources.
We also had Cain and Abel.
Right, the sacrifice there, yeah.
That they were giving. It doesn't specify that, a person that's the tenth or anything, but he's bringing the best.
He's bringing the best, the first and the best.
Whereas the other one didn't, just won't bring anything.
Right.
She gotta be fine.
Yeah, yep. So I think that's cool. Let's go to Psalm 110, verse 4, for the other Old Testament reference to Melchizedek. Psalm 110, verse 4. Psalm 110, the entire psalm is a messianic psalm. The preacher of Hebrews has already quoted Psalm 110 twice in our study of the sermon of the book of Hebrews. And he talks about it again. His quote of this won't come until next week's study, but just this is the background from Melchizedek. So Psalm 110, I'll just read it because it's short. It says, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool." He's quoted that, he's exposited that. This is obviously Jesus. "The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power in holy garments. From the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours." And then here it is, "The Lord has sworn to my Lord." The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And then he goes on to talk about the messianic kingdom of Jesus. So Psalm 110 is all about the messianic period of time. And Jesus will be king and rule and judge and receive worship from everybody, and he will immediately obliterate any enemy that raises their hands against him. And all of that is here. And it's cool that the only other place Melchizedek shows up in the Old Testament is here, and it's in the context of a messianic prophecy. So again, if my view is right, that when Melchizedek says, I'm the king of Salem, it's because he will be the king of Jerusalem. It makes sense that it shows up again in the context of Jesus being king over Jerusalem. And it says, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. The grammar there means not that Melchizedek's priesthood will be picked up forever by Jesus, but that Jesus will be a priest forever, just like Melchizedek also is. Well, if Melchizedek were a normal mortal man, he would not be a priest forever. He would be a priest for a window of time, but not a priest forever. And Jesus is a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The only way that Jesus can be a priest forever, and Melchizedek is also a priest forever, God doesn't have two high priests, would be if those two high priests that are high priests eternally are the same high priest. Right? You don't have two high priests. Not two Aaronic high priests, not two Melchizedekian high priests. You've got one. So if Melchizedek is a priest forever and Jesus is a priest forever, they don't sit next to each other and debate what to do, right? It's the same guy. So Abraham tithes. Psalm 110 just confirms that Jesus, in my view, Jesus and Melchizedek are the same person. We have already talked about in Hebrews 6 that when God makes an oath, he cannot change it, that is what's going to happen, and we can rely on it. And so here it says the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. Melchizedek is a priest forever, and so is Messiah. Again, I think that's the same person. Okay? Let's finally get to where we are, Hebrews 7. After having, now you've read everything the Old Testament says about Melchizedek. You're Melchizedek scholars. You are experts. I expect your monographs to come out next week. Melchizedek now in Hebrews 7. The first 3 verses give us information about Melchizedek that the Old Testament does not. So when we read this, we're going to say, oh, I didn't read that in Genesis 14. I didn't read that in Psalm 110. And there's 2 things you can assume that from this. There's 2 options. The camp that says Melchizedek is a real dude, a mortal man, who was a king and a priest, and as a picture of Christ, they say that all these things you're about to read about Melchizedek are arguments from silence. That because God did not tell us who his mother and father are, the preacher of Hebrews just says he doesn't have one. But that it's not that he doesn't have one, it's that we don't know who they are. Right? That all of this is an argument from silence. But I think the preacher of Hebrews makes too big a deal about it for it to just be him saying, I don't know who these people are. So let's read again the first 3 verses.
I think
Yep.
it's my perspective is that it's a stressing of, with a Jewish audience, the Jews put a lot of stock into the genealogy
Right.
of the Levitical priesthood.
Right.
And so the priesthood was all about bloodline.
Right.
But the Bible, my perspective, is emphasizing a lack of genealogy for Melchizedek because it wants to emphasize the fact that it's not a priesthood based on bloodline,
Right.
but a priesthood based on a direct anointing
Yep.
of God himself.
Yeah, and lots of people agree with you. Yeah, totally true. Totally true. Lots of people say that same thing. So yeah, and this is one of those things that people disagree on. So feel free to wind up in the other camp. That's totally fine. I still love you. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God.
You're not going to call me a hater or a racist?
Not at all. Not at all. I probably won't turn your car over afterwards. Met Abram, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. We had that story. And met Abram and to him Abram apportioned a 10th part of everything. We read that story. And then here's here's some new stuff. He is first by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. We didn't know that if you just read Genesis 14. The preacher does that for us. And then he's also King of Salem, that is King of Peace. So he gives us the meaning of the title that he takes upon himself, King of Peace. And then verse 3 does not come from the Old Testament. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. So, the preacher is either saying, we don't know, and that's a big deal, and so I'm going to say we don't know. But he doesn't say we don't know, he says it isn't there. And I think that's too strong to just, if he were to say, he could have said, he is not a priest by genealogy. But he says he doesn't have genealogy. And that's a different thing, I think. Feel free to tell me I'm wrong. He doesn't have a mom, he doesn't have a dad, he doesn't have an ancestor. Now, Jesus had, in his physical nature, parents, and biologically a mother, and he has a genealogy. Jesus has a genealogy. It's in Matthew 1, right? And it's in Luke 2. So there's a sense that Jesus does have parents in a genealogy. But if you're talking about the Jesus that showed up in Genesis 14, that Christophany appearing of Christ, no biological antecedents. Mm-hmm. His physical body was created for the moment and then ceased to exist. If it's that way. And if it's that way, then you can read this literally. He has no mother, he has no father, he has no genealogy, he was never born, he never died. And that's what the text says. And so that makes more sense to me in my reading, to just read it simple, read it literal, read it for what it says. But then there's this obstacle to my point of view, and I'll admit it. It says, resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. Resembling. It doesn't say he is the Son of God. So, you either have to argue with he has no mom, dad, genealogy, birth, or death. And he lives forever, because it says that, simply. Or you have to wrestle with this resembling thing. Okay, so I'm going to have to wrestle with resembling, because I accept the others. Resembling, that word only shows up here in the New Testament, nowhere else. So we can't go to any other place in the Bible and say, here's what this word also means. I did some digging around in Koine Greek literature that was not the Bible, and found that it shows up in a drama, in a fictitious drama, 5 times in this play that was written in Koine Greek, and all 5 times it's talking about a work of art that is like somebody, a statue. All 5 times it's the statue of someone, the resembling. So the statue is not exactly the same thing as the person. But it is very, very, very close to what the author says in chapter 1. I wrote it down. Sorry. Chapter 1, verse, didn't write it down. Great. Where it says that Jesus is the exact representation of his nature, of the nature of God.
Oh, was that?
Hebrews, it's in Colossians, but it's also in Hebrews.
Oh, okay.
There it is. Hebrews 1:3. He is the radiance and the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. Mm-hmm. It's not the same word, but it's the same idea. That we have God the Father and we have Jesus, and Jesus perfectly represents God the Father. I would love if the Hebrews author had used the same word, but he didn't. But it's in the same sense, where there's the person and then there's the statue of the person, and the statue of the person is exactly like the person, but it's not the person, but it's just like him. And so I'm doing my best with this, and then it occurred to me Daniel 7:13, when Jesus shows up, and we know that Daniel 7:13 is Jesus because Jesus tells us that it is. Daniel 7:13, that vision says, one like the Son of Man. And Jesus says, that's me. Oh, okay, cool. So then go to the Septuagint that tells that story in Greek, and I got all excited because maybe it's the same word. It's not. But it's like that, right? He resembles the Son of God. And Daniel 7:13, the vision is one like the Son of Man. It's the same word in English. Isn't that close enough? I don't know. So this is a fly in the ointment of my perspective, but all the other words in the verse are the fly in the ointment of the other perspective. So I've got less flies. So do with that as you will. He resembles the Son of God, and he continues as a priest forever. Okay. I think it's important too in verse 2 that righteousness comes before peace. His name is King of Righteousness, and his role is King of Peace. And righteousness comes before peace. You cannot have peace with God if you do not have the righteousness of Christ. There are lots of people who do not have the righteousness of Christ and are trying to find peace with God. And they're doing it through meditation, and they're doing it through the emergent church, and they're doing it through all kinds of feel-good self-help seminars, and they're doing it with good works and giving to charity, and they're seeking after peace, but you cannot have peace if you don't have the righteousness of God. I also think it's cool that, for the sake of time, we're not going to turn there, but Isaiah 9, chapter 9, verses 6 and 7, clearly about Messiah. It says, it calls Messiah in that verse, in those two verses, both King of Righteousness and Prince of Peace. And I think that's cool, because Melchizedek is King of Righteousness and Prince of Peace. Jesus is King of Righteousness and Prince of Peace. And when you have the righteousness of Christ, and he brings that into your life, then you can have peace with him. Lots of other verses under that heading, but I'm looking at the time, and I want to keep moving. So you can look at the notes for all the other references if you're interested. Moving on. Verse 4, we're going to get into this next paragraph, and there are two things that are talked about in verse 4. Verse 4 through 10, sorry, this next paragraph. Two things that are talked about. One is the tithe. He talks about the tithe a lot. And the other one is the blessing. And here, after he's set up what I think is Melchizedek is Jesus, and Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, Jesus is greater than Abraham, and that's the point of what he's trying to get to, is Jesus is a bigger deal than Abraham. He says that Jesus is a bigger deal than Abraham because of two things. One is the tithe, and the other is the blessing. So let's reread this paragraph. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of the spoils. And the descendants of Levi, who received the priestly office, have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brethren, though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham, and blessed him who had the promise. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, the tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, here's another reason I think it's Jesus, by one of whom it is testified that he lives, present tense. Melchizedek lives today, according to the preacher of Hebrews. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Okay, so for Jews, the ancestor is always greater than the descendant. You are never greater than your father. And your grandchildren must always respect you. Right? And so Levi is the head of the whole priestly tribe. Levi is greater than any one priest. Levi is the great-grandson of Abraham. Levi is not as big a deal as Abraham. And so Abraham is pretty much the pinnacle of respect in the Jewish community. Nobody respects anybody more than Abraham in the Jewish world. He's the one who starts the whole thing, right? Moses is also pretty amazing, but Abraham starts the whole thing. So to have Abraham be blessed by Melchizedek, Melchizedek is saying, I am greater than you, and I have something you don't, and I can bless you with it. So Melchizedek is bigger deal than Abraham. And the point of the book of Hebrews is not as an argument for why Melchizedek should be worshipped, right? So there's no sense lifting Melchizedek up above Abraham unless you're also saying that this is how high we should lift Jesus, right? Jesus being the same person. So Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. He blesses Abraham. He has something that Abraham does not. And Abraham gives him a tithe. And you tithe to someone greater than you, right? We tithe to a couple of missionaries and to our church. And we do that because these people are doing work I can't. And so I honor them. And I give them portions of our money. I could tithe to somebody who's doing less in the kingdom, but that would be weird. That would be weird, right? So you tithe to someone greater than you in ministry and in purpose and in scope, and someone who's doing things in the kingdom that you can't do. And so you want to support them in what they're doing and bless them. And then the blessings come down to you. So he makes this argument that Levi is lesser than Abraham, Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. It's this big greater than less than statement. And so the argument only makes sense if he is going to lift Melchizedek up and then replace him with Jesus and say Jesus is greater than Abraham. Because everything in this book, remember, Jesus is greater than. Jesus is greater than angels, Jesus is greater than Moses, greater than the Levitical priesthood, greater than the law, greater than. And here, all of a sudden, he's talking about how amazing Melchizedek is. Well, that's a change in purpose, and that's weird. Why would you do that? No. You're doing that because you're saying Jesus is greater than Abraham, right? So that's the point. And he will get more explicit about that in the second half of chapter 7. But in this, I just want to build up to that Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, Jesus is greater than Abraham, and this would have made Jews fall out of their chairs. Wait, he's greater than Abraham? Nobody's greater than Abraham. Yes, Jesus is greater than Abraham. So to apply it to us, to Gentiles living where we don't go to temple and we're not tempted to go to temple, what do we do with that? What do 21st century Gentiles do with the first half of Hebrews 7? There are other religious systems that have priests. And I think a couple of us came out of Catholicism, came out of the Catholic background. I am not a Catholic basher. Please don't take this and say Jason hates Catholics. I don't. I love Catholics. But part of what is wrong in their view of things is that there needs to be somebody between me and the Father, that I cannot approach the Father. And the word priest, the etymology of that word means bridge builder. That's what the word means. So when you're a bridge builder, you've got someone over there, and you've got someone over there, and they can't get to each other, and you build a bridge. That's what the word priest means. We don't need that anymore. Hebrews 4:16, remember, says, because we have this great high priest in Jesus, let us therefore boldly approach the throne of grace. And so we need to realize that Jesus is the only bridge that we'll ever need, right? You don't need to go to anybody. So if you're encountering Catholics who love Jesus, don't tell them that they're going to hell. They aren't. And Protestants have done a very bad job of loving our Catholic brothers and sisters closer to Jesus. But it is true that they have a sense of an artificial barrier that they need to get past. That they don't have to go to Father someone to ask them to go to God for me. And they don't have to pray to a saint to ask that saint to go to God for me. And they don't have to pray to Mary to ask Mary to go to God for me. That they can just go to the Father. And I think this is such an amazing freedom that we enjoy. And I don't think we make enough of that in our life. I've got two people wanting to talk. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, plus they have to know that there's no difference for the church, and I believe that Catholics love to say, well, say, are you a Christian? You say, no, I'm a Catholic.
Right. Yeah.
They think there's a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to be fair, Protestants.
Somebody else goes to another church.
Yeah. 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 What were you going to say?
The Catholic priesthood does two things. First, three things actually, but like you said, it creates an artificial mediator that you don't need.
Right.
And that in turn, I think because I grew up Catholic, well, at least since I was 12ish. But I saw in most of my friends that, and in my own life, that God, we believed in Him and respected Him, that there was no personal relationship.
Right.
Because the entire relationship was lived through the priest, lived through the church.
Right.
And the relationship was with the church and not with God Himself.
Right.
And that priesthood creates that artificial barrier.
Right.
And I think keeps a lot of people from a saving faith.
Right. Yep.
And
yep.
secondly, it's almost blasphemous to a point where the performance of the priest was to also offer up the sacrifice.
Right.
And so when
Yes.
they do communion, they literally are redoing the literal sacrifice
Right.
of Christ.
Right.
So they continue to perform an action that was completed.
Right.
And so it's really borderline blasphemy when you think about it.
Right. Yep.
Because it's saying that Christ's death was not enough. You have to keep doing it
Right.
for sin to be forgiven.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
I think that for me, the story of Melchizedek really drives home that the idea of earthly priests, of human priests, that are part of the formal priestly structure, is just not for our time. It's
Right.
not for the Christian church.
Right. Yeah, totally agree. And that's, yeah, the Levitical priesthood served its role for that dispensation, for that unfolding of God's plan, but it was bounded on both ends by a definite line in time. And it is not for today. And it's interesting because there are still Jews who call themselves the Cohen, and they say that they are descended from the priestly line. But the records of all of their genealogy was destroyed when the temple was destroyed.
Right.
So there are Cohen who can trace their family genealogy back to AD 70, and they will claim that so-and-so, Yosef ben whatever, was a priest, and I can show that I'm tied to him. But you have to take their word for it that this guy was a priest, because the ancestry, the genealogy doesn't go beyond that. All the genealogical records extant at the time were kept in the temple. They safeguarded the genealogical records of the priest to demonstrate that they were priests, and they didn't want anybody else to mess that up. Well, that got destroyed when the temple got destroyed. So now you have to take somebody's word that they're a priest. And that doesn't fly. And that doesn't fly even within the Bible. There are times when people came back from captivity and couldn't demonstrate that they were a priest, and they said, "But I am," and they said, "No, you can't be." So the rules exclude them by their own rules. So yeah, there was a time for that, but it's not the general revelation of God because it wasn't necessary before, and it isn't necessary now. Yeah. So yes.
I was going to say the Catholics also, depending where it's from, makes a big difference. Like, for example, Catholic in the Philippines and in Spain, which we have adopted so much of those, the rules and the regulations that is bound in them. That's why when I became a Christian, my heart's desire is to witness to Catholics and let them know. Because we are taught that God will listen to Mary more than He would listen to me.
Right.
So there's so many of those superstitions in between.
Right.
So it is hard for me to really look at the Catholic and say I'm a Christian.
Right.
Because in my mind I'd be like, well, if you truly seek the Lord, He will deliver you from the bondage of Catholic.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So those are the things that are just different in where they're coming from. And in the relationship with Christ.
Right.
Because they place more emphasis on relationship with Mary first and the priest than before Christ.
Right.
But I always noticed that one of the reasons I left when I went to Catholic school and graduated. But the thing is, we were never taught to really read the Bible.
Right.
That's where the problem comes in.
Right.
You just listen to the priest and then you go to church and that's it, and you say the same phrases.
Right.
But you're never taught to get into the Word of God
Right.
on your own, where you could actually notice
Mm-hmm.
that some of the things that we're being taught were not biblically accurate. And once you do that for so many years,
Mm-hmm.
so obviously.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, yeah, and it all comes down to, is there that love relationship between you and Jesus, and do you understand what he's done for you? And I was never a member of the Catholic Church. I was never raised in the Catholic Church, so I don't have the perspective that you guys do that were. But I know that I have encountered many Catholics who are passionately in love with Jesus. And I do not question their salvation. I wonder why they carry around so much more baggage. But I don't question their salvation, you know. And so there are Protestant churches where just as much weird stuff can get in the way between you and a deep love relationship with Jesus. So all of these problems are problems, but they're not necessarily uniquely and exclusively Catholic problems. You can have these same problems, you know, in a Baptist church if you've got a relationship with the preacher and not with Jesus. So yeah, the thing that I want to come back to and kind of put a bow on with this whole thing is what Hebrews 4:16 said, that Jesus is the only bridge we need. You know, and we have a direct connection to God, and I don't think we who understand that make a big enough deal about that with the outside world, because I think some people don't really know what the difference between a church like ours and, I'm just going to pick another denomination, and like some of the more liberal Lutheran sorts of churches are. Definitely not Catholic, but they still have a lot of baggage, right? And they're like, well, what's the difference? The difference is we know Jesus. We don't know people who know Jesus.
Exactly.
We know Jesus, like directly, as much as I know my wife. And I don't have to have a mediator to talk to my wife. You know, I don't write a letter to Riza and ask her to write a letter to Emily. Maybe sometimes that might help. But we don't have that, right? There's an intimacy here, and that intimacy is what we're supposed to have. So anyway, that's the point.